The gavel struck the wood with a sickening crack that echoed through the smoky gambling hall of 1842 London. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of aristocrats and debt-ridden gamblers. £10. That was the price placed on the head of Lady Genevieve, a woman once rumoured to be royalty, now sold like cattle because she refused to utter a single word. They called her the mute doll. They laughed when the scarred, reclusive Duke of Ashbourne threw the coins on the table, buying her solely to silence his nagging family. But they wouldn't be laughing in 3 months, when the King of Prussia visited and the silent bride opened her mouth to save the entire British Empire from war. The stench of stale tobacco and desperation clung to the heavy velvet curtains of the Gilded Cage, a notorious underground club in the heart of London, where fortunes were lost and souls were bartered. It was October 14th, 1842. Outside, the fog was thick enough to choke a man, but inside, the air was hot with malice. Standing on a raised wooden platform was a woman who looked entirely out of place among the sweating, shouting men. Genevieve Dubois stood with her back rigid, her chin tilted slightly upward. She wore a dress of grey wool, frayed at the hems, yet it could not hide the aristocratic line of her neck or the sharp intelligence in her emerald eyes. Her hands were bound loosely with a silk cord, a theatrical touch by her stepfather, Lord Archibald Stirling, no relation to the Duke, a man whose gambling debts had finally eclipsed his humanity. "Look at her," Archibald slurred, waving a half-empty bottle of brandy towards the girl. "Fine breeding. A face to launch 1,000 ships, eh? But damaged goods, gentlemen. Broken. Hasn't spoken a word in 5 years. Not a squeak." The crowd roared with laughter. A woman who didn't speak? To the misogynistic peers of the realm, it sounded like a comedy, not a tragedy. "What good is a silent wife, Archibald?" shouted a portly viscount from the front row. "How will she scream when the house catches fire?" "She's docile," Archibald countered, sweat beading on his forehead. He needed £500 to clear his debt with the localized crime syndicate. "A perfect ornament. I start the bidding at £100. Silence followed. Not the silence of respect, but of mockery. "100? For a mute?" someone jeered. "I'll give you 5. Genevieve did not flinch. She stared at a spot on the far wall, her face a mask of porcelain indifference. Inside, however, her mind was racing. She was calculating the distance to the door, the weight of the bouncer by the exit, and the probability of surviving on the streets of London with no money. She wasn't silent because she couldn't speak. She was silent because, in a world where words were used to lie and manipulate, she had chosen to observe. And she had learned that men revealed their darkest secrets when they thought no one was listening. £10. A deep, gravelly voice cut through the jeers like a rusted blade. The room went deathly quiet. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. Walking out of the shadows was a figure that made even the drunkest gambler sober up. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in black mourning clothes that looked expensive but severely neglected. A silver-handled cane tapped rhythmically against the floorboards, but it was his face that drew the stares. Half of it was handsome, ruggedly classical. The other half was marred by burn scars that ran from his temple down to his jaw, a souvenir from the fire that had killed his parents and brother 10 years ago. It was Sebastian Blackwood, the Duke of Ashbourne, the Devil Duke. Archibald swallowed hard. Your Grace. £10? Surely you jest. The girl is worth nothing to you, or she wouldn't be here, Sebastian said, stepping up to the platform. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked only at Genevieve. His eyes were dark, devoid of warmth, analyzing her like a horse at a market. £10. That is the price of the debt you owe my solicitor for the lease on your crumbling estate, Archibald. I am buying her to cancel that debt. Do you accept, or shall I have you thrown in Newgate prison by morning?" Archibald looked at the menacing Duke, then at the silent crowd. He snatched the small bag of coins Sebastian tossed onto the table. "Sold!" Archibald cried, eager to be rid of the burden. "Take her. She's your problem now. But be warned, Ashbourne. She's dim-witted. Doesn't understand a thing." Sebastian ignored him. He drew a small knife from his boot. Genevieve tensed, her eyes finally locking onto his. For a second, something flashed between them, fear meeting resolve. With a swift motion, Sebastian cut the silk cord binding her wrists. "Come," he commanded, his voice cold and flat. "I have a carriage waiting, and I have no patience for dawdling." Genevieve rubbed her wrists. She could have run. She could have fought. But she looked at the scar on his face and saw something familiar, a deep, festering pain that mirrored her own. She nodded once and stepped down from the platform. She was no longer a daughter. She was property, a 10-pound duchess. The carriage ride to Derbyshire took 3 days. For most of that time, silence reigned supreme. Sebastian sat opposite her, reading documents, occasionally glancing out the window at the passing rain. He offered her food and water with mechanical politeness, but made no attempt at conversation. To him, she was a solution to a logistical problem. The Crown had been threatening to seize his estate if he didn't marry and produce an heir within the year, an archaic clause in his father's will designed to force the reclusive Duke back into society. He needed a body. He didn't need a soul. A mute wife was, in his cynical estimation, a blessing. No questions about his scars. No prying into the nightmares that woke him screaming. Genevieve, however, was not idle. While feigning sleep or staring blankly at the upholstery, she was analyzing the documents he left carelessly on the seat next to him when he dozed off. A letter from the French ambassador regarding trade tariffs. A threatening note from a supplier in Hamburg, written in rough German. An architectural blueprint for a new wing of the Ashbourne estate, annotated in Italian. She read them all in mere glances. Her mind was a steel trap. Her father, a diplomat before his death, had raised her across Europe. She spoke 7 languages fluently: English, French, German, Italian, Spanish, Russian, and Latin. She understood politics, economics, and warfare better than most members of Parliament. But after her father died, and she fell into the clutches of her stepfather, she learned that a smart woman was a threat. A silent woman was invisible. When the carriage finally rolled through the iron gates of Ashbourne Manor, the reality of her new life set in. The estate was massive, Gothic, and imposing, built of dark grey stone that seemed to absorb the light. It sat on the edge of a cliff overlooking a churning sea, isolated and wind-battered. The staff was lined up to meet them. They looked tired and weary. "This is Mrs. Halloway," Sebastian said, gesturing to a stern-faced housekeeper. "She will show you to your quarters. We will dine at 7. Do not be late." He didn't wait for a response. He turned and marched towards the library, his limp more pronounced after the long journey. Genevieve was led up the grand staircase. The house was dusty, the portraits of ancestors covered in sheets. It felt like a mausoleum. "I don't know what trick you played to trap the master," Mrs. Halloway muttered as she opened the door to a large, cold bedroom. "But don't expect to be coddled here. The Duke is a hard man. He has no heart left to give." Genevieve looked at the housekeeper and gave a small, polite nod. He has a heart, she thought, remembering the way his hand had trembled slightly when he cut her bonds. It is just buried under ash. The next few weeks fell into a monotonous rhythm. Genevieve was treated less like a duchess and more like a ghost. The local gentry shunned her. The servants whispered about the dumb duchess behind her back. One rainy afternoon, Genevieve wandered into the library. Sebastian was not there, but his desk was a chaotic mess of papers. She approached cautiously. Lying open was a letter from a Russian count, vaguely threatening to cut off the timber supply essential for the Ashbourne mines. The letter was in Cyrillic. Next to it, Sebastian had scribbled a translation on a separate sheet of paper. Genevieve looked at his translation. It was wrong. crucially wrong. Sebastian had mistranslated the word for negotiation as ultimatum. He was preparing to send a hostile reply that would destroy his business and likely bankrupt the estate within months. She hesitated. If she corrected it, she revealed herself. If she stayed silent, the man who had saved her, however coldly, would be ruined. She looked at the door. It was empty. Trembling, she picked up a quill. She didn't write a note. Instead, she took a fresh sheet of paper and wrote out the correct translation in perfect, elegant handwriting. She placed it directly on top of the Russian letter. Then she heard the heavy thud of a cane in the hallway. Panic surged through her. She dropped the quill and scrambled towards the bookshelves, grabbing a random volume and pretending to read just as the heavy oak door creaked open. Sebastian entered. He looked exhausted, his cravat loosened, his scars vivid in the dim light. He stopped when he saw her. "I prefer solitude when I work," he grunted, walking to his desk. Genevieve bowed her head and moved to leave. "Wait." The single word froze her hand on the doorknob. Sebastian was staring at the desk. He picked up the paper she had written. He read it once, then twice. He looked at the Russian letter, then back at her translation. Slowly, he turned his head to look at her. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with a sudden, dangerous electricity. "Who was in here?" he asked, his voice low. Genevieve turned, keeping her face blank. She shrugged slightly, mimicking ignorance. Sebastian walked around the desk, approaching her like a predator cornering prey. He held the paper up. "This ink is wet," he whispered. "You are the only one here." He stepped closer, towering over her. For the first time, he didn't look at her like she was furniture. He looked at her with a mixture of confusion and intense suspicion. "This is a perfect translation of a dialect from St. Petersburg," he said, searching her eyes. "My translator in London couldn't even pass this. Who are you, Genevieve?" She stared up at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Not yet," she told herself. "It is not time yet." She reached out, took the paper from his hand, and crumpled it into a ball, tossing it into the fireplace. Then she curtsied and walked out the door, leaving the Duke of Ashbourne standing alone in the shadows, his world tilting on its axis. For the next week, the atmosphere in Ashbourne Manor was suffocating. Sebastian did not mention the Russian letter again, but his behavior changed. He stopped looking past Genevieve and started watching her. He watched how her eyes scanned the titles of the books on the shelves. He watched how she paused when the servants gossiped in the hallway. He watched the way her fingers twitched as if holding an imaginary pen. He was testing her. He would leave complex engineering manuals open on the table, only to find them moved slightly hours later. He would mutter insults in Latin under his breath, waiting for a flinch. She gave him nothing. Genevieve knew that her silence was her armor. If she spoke, she became real. If she became real, she could be hurt. Then came the invitation from Lord Bennet. Bennet was a neighboring landowner, a man whose wealth was only matched by his gluttony and lack of morals. He had been trying to buy a portion of Sebastian's coastal land for years to build a smuggling port, though he disguised it as a fishing venture. "We are dining at Bennet's estate tonight," Sebastian announced one morning, his voice challenging. "He insists I bring my new bride. He wants to inspect my purchase." Genevieve froze while pouring tea, but recovered instantly. She nodded. The dinner was an ordeal. Bennet's dining hall was garish, filled with stolen art and overspiced food. Bennet sat at the head of the table, his face flushed with wine, while two of his business associates, men from the Dutch East India Company, sat opposite Sebastian. "A mute," Bennet guffawed, spraying crumbs of bread. "Ashbourne, you are a genius. A woman who cannot nag. Does she perform tricks? Can she juggle?" Sebastian gripped his wine glass so hard the stem threatened to snap. "She is my wife, Bennet. Watch your tongue." "Oh, touchy," Bennet sneered. Then he turned to the Dutch associates. He switched languages, speaking in a rapid, low dialect of Dutch that few Englishmen would know. "The Duke is desperate," Bennett said in Dutch, grinning at Sebastian while he spoke. "Get him to sign the coastal lease tonight. Tell him the clause about the mineral rights is standard. Once he signs, we strip the mines within a month and leave him with the hollow shell. He'll be bankrupt by Christmas." The Dutchman nodded, smiling politely at Sebastian. "He looks like a burned dog," one of the Dutchmen added. "Does he really think we are offering fair market value?" Sebastian looked between them. He knew French and Italian, but his Dutch was non-existent. He sensed the mockery, but couldn't prove the deceit. He picked up the contract Bennett had slid across the table. The numbers looked good. Too good. But he needed the money to pay the interest on the debts Genevieve's stepfather had saddled him with. He dipped his quill into the inkwell. "Sign it, you fool," Bennett whispered in Dutch, his eyes gleaming with greed. Genevieve sat like a statue. Her heart was pounding against her corset. If he signed, Ashbourne Manor was lost. The servants would be destitute. Sebastian, the man who had bought her not for pleasure, but to save his family name, would be destroyed. She couldn't speak. Not here. Not in front of these vultures. As Sebastian lowered the pen to the paper, Genevieve moved. She reached for the heavy silver pitcher of red wine. With a clumsy theatrical jerk of her arm, she accidentally knocked the pitcher over. The wine flooded across the table. It soaked the tablecloth, the roasted pheasant, and, most importantly, it drenched the contract Sebastian was about to sign. "You stupid cow!" Bennett roared, jumping up as wine dripped onto his lap. "Genevieve!" Sebastian snapped, pulling his hand back just in time. The contract was ruined, the ink bleeding into a purple mess. Genevieve stood up, her face a mask of horror. She clutched her throat, acting out a silent apology, trembling. "Get her out of here!" Bennett screamed. "She's ruined the papers. We'll have to draw up new ones. It will take days." "I am leaving," Sebastian said, standing up. He looked at the ruined contract, then at Genevieve. He saw the way she was trembling. It didn't look like fear. It looked like adrenaline. He grabbed her arm, perhaps a little too tightly, and dragged her out to the carriage. The ride home was silent and furious. Sebastian stared at her in the darkness. "You are not clumsy," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I have seen you thread a needle by candlelight. You have the hands of a surgeon. You knocked that wine over on purpose." "Why?" Genevieve stared out the window. "Answer me," he shouted, striking the wall of the carriage. "Why did you stop me from signing? Do you want me to fail? Do you want me to starve?" She turned to him. Her emerald eyes blazed with a fierce intensity that silenced him. She raised one hand and tapped her temple, then pointed to his heart. "Think," she was saying. Sebastian fell back against the seat, exhaling shaky breath. He closed his eyes, the image of the ruined contract burning in his mind. And then, the suspicion that had been gnawing at him began to take a definitive shape. She hadn't ruined the deal to spite him. She had ruined it to save him. But how could she know? Unless she understood Dutch. 2 weeks later, the first snow of November hit Derbyshire. It was a brutal storm, burying the roads and isolating the manor. The wind howled through the chimneys like a banshee. Sebastian had fallen ill. The stress of the failing estate, combined with the damp cold, had inflamed the old injuries in his lungs from the fire. He lay in the master bedroom, burning with fever, thrashing in his sleep. The local doctor had been summoned, but the snow had blocked the pass. Mrs. Halloway was in a panic. "The fever is too high," the housekeeper cried, wringing her hands. "He's hallucinating. He keeps calling for his brother. If the fever doesn't break tonight—" Genevieve pushed past her. She entered the room where the Duke lay. He looked pale, the scars on his face standing out in stark, angry contrast to his skin. He was muttering, his head tossing on the pillow. "Get me cool water, vinegar, and willow bark," Genevieve wrote on a slate she now carried. Mrs. Halloway hesitated, then ran to obey. For 3 days and 3 nights, Genevieve did not leave his side. She bathed his forehead. She brewed teas from herbs she found in the kitchen garden, utilizing remedies she had learned from a healer in the Swiss Alps years ago. She slept in a chair next to his bed, waking at his slightest movement. On the 4th night, the crisis peaked. Sebastian woke with a gasp, his eyes wide but unseeing. He grabbed Genevieve's wrist, his grip bruising. "Don't let them in," he rasped, staring at the shadows in the corner of the room. "The fire, the smoke. Mother is still in there. I have to go back." He tried to climb out of bed. He was delirious, convinced the house was burning again. "Sebastian, no," Genevieve whispered. It was a breath of sound, barely audible. He didn't hear her. He fought against her, his strength amplified by the fever. "Let me go! I have to save them!" He swung his legs out of bed. If he wandered into the freezing hallway in his condition, the chill would kill him instantly. He pushed Genevieve aside, stumbling toward the door. Genevieve scrambled up. She grabbed his shoulders, trying to hold him back. But he was a large man, and panic made him powerful. He reached for the heavy iron door handle. She had no choice. "Sebastian, stop!" The voice was clear, melodic, and commanding. It rang through the room with the authority of a queen. It was a voice that had debated philosophy in Paris and negotiated prices in Rome. It was not the voice of a mute doll. Sebastian froze. His hand hovered over the doorknob. The sound seemed to pierce through his delirium, anchoring him back to reality. He turned slowly. His eyes were glassy, but there was a flicker of recognition. Who is there?" Genevieve stepped into the light of the fireplace. She looked him in the eye, her chest heaving. "It is only a dream, Sebastian," she said, her voice soft now, trembling slightly. "There is no fire. You are safe. I'm here." Sebastian stared at her. He blinked, trying to clear the fog from his mind. You spoke." "Come back to bed," she commanded gently, ignoring his shock. She took his hand. "You will die if you leave this room." He let her lead him back to the bed. He was too weak to fight, his mind too fractured to process the impossibility of the moment. As his head hit the pillow, he kept his eyes on her. "Genevieve," he whispered. "Sleep," she said. She began to hum a lullaby, a French song about a clear moon and a calm sea. Sebastian's eyes drifted shut. He thought he was dreaming. He had to be dreaming. The silent girl who had cost £10 was singing to him in perfect French contralto. When he woke the next morning, the fever had broken. The sun was shining off the snow outside, filling the room with blinding white light. He sat up, his body aching, but his mind sharp. He looked around. Genevieve was asleep in the armchair, her head resting on her hand. He remembered. Or did he? It felt like a hallucination. The voice had been too perfect, too cultured. He watched her stir. She opened her eyes, saw him awake, and immediately straightened, reverting to a submissive, silent persona. She stood up, curtsied, and moved to check the water pitcher. "Stop," Sebastian said. His voice was raspy from disuse. She froze. "Come here." She walked to the side of the bed. She looked at him with innocent, questioning eyes. "Drop the act," Sebastian said, his voice hardening. "I heard you, last night. You told me to stop. You sang to me." Genevieve tilted her head, confusion playing across her features. She touched her throat and shook her head sadly, miming that she had no voice. Sebastian laughed, a dry, bitter sound. "You are good. You are very good. But I am not Archibald. And I am not delirious anymore." He reached out and grabbed her hand, pulling her closer so their faces were inches apart. "You speak French," he whispered. "You understand Dutch. You corrected my Russian translation. And last night, you saved my life with the king's English." He searched her eyes, looking for the crack in the facade. "Why?" he asked, his voice dropping to a plea. "Why the silence? Are you a spy, an assassin sent to finish what the fire started?" Genevieve looked at him. She saw the fear behind his anger. She saw a man who had been betrayed by everyone he ever trusted. She realized that maintaining the lie now would only hurt him more. She took a deep breath. The silence of 5 years was a heavy weight to lift. "I am not a spy, Your Grace," she said. Her voice was raspy from years of disuse, but distinct. Sebastian gasped, the sound escaping him as if he had been punched. He let go of her hand, falling back against the pillows, staring at her as if she had just grown wings. "I am a survivor," she continued, her voice gaining strength, "just like you." "Who are you?" Sebastian breathed. "I am Lady Genevieve of the House of Valois," she said, standing tall. "My father was a diplomat. My mother was a scholar. When they died, my stepfather wanted to sell me to the highest bidder. I knew that if I spoke, if I showed my mind, he would sell me to a man who would break me for sport. So I became a doll. Dolls are easily discarded. Dolls are sold for £10 to a duke everyone believes is a monster." She paused, looking at his scars. "But you are not a monster, Sebastian. You are just a man in pain. And I am tired of being silent." Sebastian stared at her for a long time. The silence that stretched between them now was not empty. It was heavy with truth. "7 languages," he muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. "The rumor at the club. They said you were dim-witted." "Men often mistake silence for stupidity," Genevieve said with a small, wry smile. Sebastian looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in 10 years, the ice around his heart began to crack. He didn't just have a wife. He had an equal. "We have much to discuss, Genevieve," he said, a new light in his eyes. "Because if you understand Dutch, you know that Lord Bennet is planning to destroy us. He plans to use an old maritime law to seize your ships," Genevieve said immediately. "I read his ledger while you were arguing. But there is a loophole. If you secure a royal charter before the winter solstice, his claim is void." Sebastian laughed. It was a genuine, full-throated laugh that startled the birds outside the window. "A royal charter," he grinned, the scars on his face stretching. "That is impossible to get, unless one has a connection to the crown." "Or," Genevieve said, her eyes twinkling, "unless one knows that the King of Prussia is visiting London next month, and he is in desperate need of a translator who speaks the dialect of the Silesian mining guilds, a dialect I happen to speak fluently." Sebastian stared at her. The mute doll was plotting to save his empire. "We have work to do, my lady," he said. The dynamic within Ashbourne Manor shifted overnight. The house, once a mausoleum of silence and regret, became a hive of frantic, brilliant activity. The servants, initially confused by the sudden vocalization of their mistress, quickly fell in line when they realized that for the first time in a decade, the Duke was smiling. The library became their war room. "Bennet has leverage on the Admiralty Board," Sebastian said, pacing the length of the room. He tossed a stack of ledgers onto the desk. "He's blocked my request for a shipping permit. Without that permit, even if we get the King's ear, we can't transport the coal." Genevieve sat at the desk, surrounded by maps of Prussia and the North Sea. She was no longer wearing the frayed grey wool dress. She wore a gown of deep emerald velvet, an old dress of Sebastian's mother found in the attic, tailored rapidly by Mrs. Halloway to fit Genevieve's slender frame. "Bennet thinks like a pirate, not a politician," Genevieve said, her voice sharp and clear. She dipped a quill into ink. "He blocks the port of Dover because that is where the trade usually flows." "So, we do not use Dover. Where else can we dock a fleet of that size?" Sebastian asked, stopping to look at her. "Hull," Genevieve replied, tracing a line on the map. "The port authority in Hull is run by a man named Elias Thorne. He is a gambler, much like my stepfather, but he has a weakness. He loves Italian opera." "No." Sebastian raised an eyebrow. "And?" "And," Genevieve smiled, a dangerous glint in her eyes. "I once met him in Milan when my father was stationed there. I know that he owes a significant debt to the Venetian banks. If you buy that debt, which costs a fraction of the Dover permit, you own him. We can bypass Bennett entirely." Sebastian stared at her. "You remember a Port Authority official from Milan?" "I remember everyone, Sebastian," she said softly. "When you are silent, people become careless. They assume you are part of the scenery. I have catalogues of secrets in my head, waiting to be used." For the next 3 weeks, they worked in perfect tandem. Sebastian handled the finances, liquidating family heirlooms he had previously been too sentimental to touch. "They are just things," he told her when she objected. "You are the future." Genevieve handled the diplomacy. She drafted letters in German, French, and Italian to contacts she hadn't seen in 5 years. She forged alliances, called in favors, and set traps for Bennett. But the greatest hurdle remained: the royal gala. The King of Prussia, Frederick William IV, was arriving in London for a Christmas ball hosted by Queen Victoria. It was there that the trade treaties would be signed. Access to the ball was strictly by invitation, controlled by the Lord Chamberlain, a close friend of Lord Bennett. One morning, a letter arrived on a silver tray. Sebastian opened it, his face darkening. "It is a rejection," he said, his voice flat. "We are denied entry to the gala. Bennett has spread rumors that I am unstable and that you are mentally unfit." Genevieve stood up and took the letter. She read it, then calmly walked to the fireplace and threw it into the flames. "We do not need an invitation to the front door," she said. "Genevieve, one cannot simply waltz into Buckingham Palace," Sebastian warned. "No," she agreed, "but the King of Prussia is bringing his own retinue. Among them is Count von Moltke, his chief military advisor. My father saved von Moltke's life during a hunting accident in Bavaria 10 years ago. The Count is a man of honor. If I write to him, not as the Duchess of Ashbourne, but as the daughter of the man who saved him, he will ensure we are on the guest list." "That is a gamble," Sebastian said. "If Bennett finds out, he will intercept the message." "Then we will deliver it by hand," Genevieve said. "Pack your bags, Sebastian. We are going to London, and we are not going to hide in the shadows anymore." The transformation of Genevieve was complete before they left. She spent hours practicing her elocution, ensuring her voice, rusty from years of disuse, was strong enough to project across a ballroom. Sebastian watched her with a mixture of awe and protectiveness. He realized he wasn't just bringing a wife to London. He was bringing a weapon. As the carriage was loaded, Mrs. Halloway stopped Genevieve at the door. "My lady," the housekeeper said, tears in her eyes. "Give them hell." Genevieve squeezed the older woman's hand. "I intend to, Mrs. Halloway. I intend to." London was a cacophony of gaslight, fog, and snow. The city was buzzing with excitement over the royal visit. Banners of the Prussian eagle hung alongside the Union Jack on the Mall. Sebastian and Genevieve stayed in a modest townhouse in Chelsea, avoiding the grand hotels where Bennett's spies would be watching. The reply from Count von Moltke had arrived secretly the night before the gala. It contained 2 passes, stamped with the Prussian royal seal. The night of the gala, the air outside Buckingham Palace was freezing, but inside, the ballroom was a sweltering sea of silk, diamonds, and judgment. When the usher announced, "The Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne," the room did not go silent immediately. It took a moment for the name to register, but when it did, the whispers spread like wildfire. "Ashbourne? The scarred recluse? And he brought the mute, the 10-pound bride. Look at her. She looks terrified." Genevieve did not look terrified. She wore a gown of midnight blue silk, simple yet striking, with no jewelry save for a single silver locket that had belonged to her mother. She walked with her head high, her hand resting lightly on Sebastian's arm. Sebastian, dressed in formal court attire, looked formidable. His scars were visible, unhidden by the masks society preferred. He looked like a warrior among peacocks. They descended the grand staircase. At the bottom, Holding a glass of champagne stood Lord Bennet. Beside him was Archibald Sterling, Genevieve's stepfather. Archibald looked dishevelled, his eyes bloodshot. When he saw Genevieve, he nearly choked on his drink. "You?" Archibald hissed as they approached. "What are you doing here? You were supposed to rot in Derbyshire." "Good evening, stepfather," Genevieve thought. But she said nothing. She maintained her silence. The trap had to be sprung at the perfect moment. "Ashbourne," Bennet sneered, stepping forward to block their path. "I see you forged an invitation. How desperate. I should call the guards and have you thrown out for trespassing." "We are guests of the Prussian delegation," Sebastian said, his voice cool and steady. "Prussia?" Bennet laughed loudly, drawing the attention of the nearby crowd. "You think the king wants to do business with a cripple and a dummy? I have the king's ear, Ashbourne. I have already told his advisers about your financial insolvency." Bennet leaned in close, whispering so only Sebastian could hear. "I bought your debt from the banks yesterday, Sebastian. I own Ashbourne Manor. As of tomorrow morning, you are trespassing on my property." Sebastian stiffened. This was the twist they hadn't foreseen. Bennet had moved faster than expected. "You have lost," Bennet gloated. "Go home, take your silent whore and leave." Before Sebastian could strike him, which would have caused a scandal and ruined everything, a commotion erupted at the far end of the ballroom. The music stopped. The crowd parted. King Frederick William IV of Prussia had entered. He was a red-faced man with impressive mutton chops, and he looked furious. He was shouting at a trembling British interpreter. "Ich habe gesagt, die Sohle müssen für die Schlesischen Kohlebergwerke gesenkt werden, nicht für die Textilien. Seid ihr alle taub oder einfach nur dumm?" I said the tariffs must be lowered for the Silesian coal mines, not the textiles. Are you all deaf or just stupid? The British interpreter, a young man from Oxford who clearly only knew academic German, stammered. "Your Majesty, please, the textiles are—" "No!" the king shouted, throwing his hands up. He turned to his advisor, Count von Moltke. "Is there no one on this god-forsaken island who speaks the dialect of trade? I am trying to give them millions in gold, and they talk to me about wool." The room was deathly silent. Queen Victoria looked embarrassed. The British Prime Minister looked ready to faint. The deal was collapsing before it had even begun because of a linguistic barrier. Bennet saw his opportunity. He pushed forward, dragging his own hired translator. "Your Majesty, I have a man here." The king ignored him, continuing to rant in a specific, rapid-fire dialect of German used in the mining regions of Silesia, a dialect thick with slang and technical terms. Even Bennet's translator looked lost. Sebastian looked at Genevieve. He felt her arm tense. "Now," he whispered. Genevieve stepped away from Sebastian. She walked into the center of the empty circle, directly toward the raging king. "Stop her!" Archibald shrieked from the sidelines. "She's mad! She's a mute! She'll embarrass us all!" The guards moved to intercept her. "Let her pass!" Sebastian roared, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. The command was so authoritative that the guards hesitated. Genevieve stopped 5 feet from the king. She curtsied low, a perfect courtly bow. The king stopped shouting. He looked down at this slender woman in blue. "Was willst du, Madchen?" "What do you want, girl?" he barked. Genevieve slowly rose. She looked the king in the eye. She took a breath, and then she opened her mouth. "Eure Majestat," she began, her voice ringing out like a bell, clear and melodious, speaking not just in German, but in the flawless, gritty Silesian dialect the king had been using. "Ihr sucht nach einem Partner für die Kohle, nicht für die Wohle. Ihr braucht einen Hafen im Norden, der tief genug für die neuen preußischen Dampfschiffe ist. Und ihr seid frustriert, weil diese Männer ihnen schmeicheln, anstatt Geschäfte zu machen. Your Majesty, you are looking for a partner for coal, not wool. You need a port in the north deep enough for the new Prussian steamships, and you are frustrated because these men flatter you instead of doing business." A gasp went through the room. It started from Archibald, whose jaw had literally dropped, and spread like a wave to Bennet, whose face drained of all colour. The mute doll was speaking, and she sounded like a diplomat. The king's eyes went wide. He stepped closer. Du sprichst unseren Dialekt. Wer bist du? You speak our dialect. Who are you? Ich bin Genevieve, Herzogin von Ashbourne, she replied, switching effortlessly to High German for the benefit of the court, then back to English so the Queen could understand. And my husband, the Duke, owns the only deep-water port in Hull that can accommodate your fleet without the taxation of Dover. She turned and gestured to Sebastian. He is the only man in this room who is not trying to cheat you, Your Majesty. The king threw his head back and laughed, a boisterous sound of relief. He walked past the stunned Prime Minister, past the trembling Lord Bennet, and approached Sebastian. Hull, you say? The king said in broken English. Show me the maps. Sebastian bowed. It would be my honour, Your Majesty. As Sebastian and the king began to speak, Genevieve turned to face the crowd. She found Archibald and Bennet standing there, paralysed by shock. She walked up to them. The silence of the room was now her weapon, but this time she chose to break it. Hello, stepfather, she said, her voice dripping with icy politeness. You said I was worth £10. She stepped closer to Bennet. And you, Lord Bennet? You mentioned you bought the debt to Ashbourne Manor, Bennet stammered, sweat pouring down his face. The paperwork. It is... The king just agreed to a contract worth £50,000, Genevieve whispered, loud enough for the nearby nobles to hear. I believe my husband will be clearing his debts in cash by morning. She smiled, a terrifying, beautiful smile. Now, if you will excuse me, I have a kingdom to save. She turned her back on them, but the drama was not over. As she walked away, Archibald, fueled by humiliation and brandy, lunged. You ungrateful witch, he screamed, pulling a small pistol from his coat. I made you. Genevieve, Sebastian shouted, turning from the king. The gunshot cracked through the ballroom like a whip, shattering the stunned silence. But the bullet did not find its mark. In the fraction of a second before Archibald pulled the trigger, Sebastian had moved with a speed that defied his injuries. He didn't run. He threw himself forward, not to tackle the gunman, but to shield his wife. He spun Genevieve around, wrapping his body around hers like a cloak of iron, turning his scarred back to the weapon. The bullet struck Sebastian's shoulder, tearing through the heavy velvet of his coat. He grunted, a sharp intake of breath, but he did not fall. Guards! King Frederick William IV roared, stepping forward with the fury of a soldier. Seize that man! Archibald stood frozen, the smoking pistol shaking in his hand. He looked at the weapon, then at the Duke who was still standing, then at the wall of Prussian guards rushing toward him. The realization of what he had done, attempting to assassinate a duchess in the presence of two monarchs, crashed down on him. This was not a debt he could gamble away. This was treason. As the guards tackled Archibald to the floor, pinning him beneath their boots, Lord Bennet tried to slip into the crowd, his face pale as parchment. Not so fast, Bennet, a voice rang out. It was not Sebastian. It was Count von Moltke. The Prussian general stepped in front of Bennet, blocking his escape with a wall of medals and military discipline. Your associate just attempted murder, von Moltke said coldly. And I believe you were conspiring to defraud the crown by blocking legitimate trade routes. The City of London police are waiting outside. Behind the wall of guards, Genevieve pulled back from Sebastian's embrace. Her hands were immediately on his shoulder, pressing against the wound. Her gloves turned red. You are hit, she whispered, her voice trembling for the first time that night. Sebastian looked down at her. His face was pale, beads of sweat forming on his brow, but he was smiling. It was a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes. It's just a scratch, Genevieve, he rasped. I have survived fire. A lead ball from a drunkard is nothing. He took her hand, kissing the blood-stained fingers. You saved my estate. The least I could do was save your life. The ballroom erupted into chaos, but for the Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne, the world had narrowed down to just the two of them. 3 months later, the winter snow had melted, giving way to the pale greens of early spring. Ashbourne Manor was no longer a cold, silent tomb. It was alive. The chimneys smoked day and night, the servants bustled with new uniforms and higher wages, and the library was filled with the scratching of quills. The trade deal with Prussia had been signed 2 days after the gala. The first fleet of ships was currently docking in Hull, bypassing Lord Bennet's blockade entirely. The infusion of gold from the Prussian crown had not only cleared the debts, but had made the Ashbourne estate one of the wealthiest in northern England. Sebastian sat on the terrace, watching the sea. His arm was still in a sling, but the doctor promised a full recovery. He heard the soft rustle of silk behind him. Genevieve placed a tray of tea on the table and sat beside him. She held a newspaper in her hand. "Have you seen the Morning Post?" she asked. Sebastian shook his head. "I try to avoid the gossip columns." "This is not gossip," she said, handing him the paper. "It is the court report." Sebastian looked at the headline, "Lord Bennet sentenced to transportation." The judge was not lenient, Genevieve read aloud, a note of satisfaction in her voice. "Fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. He is to be shipped to the penal colonies in Australia for a term of 20 years. His estates have been seized by the Crown to pay his creditors." "And Archibald?" Sebastian asked quietly. "Newgate Prison," Genevieve said, her face hardening slightly. "He died last night. A fever, they say. Or perhaps the realization that no one was coming to bail him out." Sebastian reached out and took her hand. "It is over, General. The ghosts are gone." Genevieve looked at him. Not all of them. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, heavy iron key. She placed it on the table between them. Sebastian looked at it. "What is this?" "Do you remember the £10 you paid for me?" she asked. "Every day," he replied. "I used the first dividend from the Prussian deal to make a purchase of my own," she said. "I bought the building in London, the Gilded Cage." Sebastian stared at her. "You bought the gambling hell where we met." "I shut it down," Genevieve said. "I fired the bouncers. I burned the tables. It is currently being renovated. It will reopen next month as a school and shelter for mute and deaf children. I have hired tutors from Paris who teach sign language." She looked at the ocean, her eyes reflecting the grey-blue water. "I was silent for 5 years because I had no power," she said. "I want to ensure that those who cannot speak are given a voice before they are sold." Sebastian looked at his wife, the woman he had bought to be a silent ornament, who had turned out to be the architect of his salvation. He brought her hand to his lips. "You are a dangerous woman, Genevieve Blackwood," he murmured. "Remind me never to play cards against you." "Oh, Sebastian," she laughed, the sound bright and free. "You already went all in. And look at what you won." She leaned in and kissed him, not as a £10 bride, but as the Duchess who had conquered London with a single sentence. The silence of Ashbourne was gone forever, replaced by the sound of a life truly lived. What a roller coaster of emotions. From being sold for the price of a cheap suit to commanding the attention of kings, Genevieve proved that silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's a strategy. She waited, she observed, and when the moment was right, she struck with the precision of a cobra. This story reminds us that people often underestimate those who are quiet. They mistook Genevieve's silence for stupidity, and that arrogance cost Archibald his freedom and Lord Bennet his empire. It's a powerful lesson in hard karma. Be careful who you step on, because you never know who they truly are. What would you have done in Genevieve's shoes? Would you have revealed your secret sooner, or waited for the perfect moment like she did? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of revenge, romance, and justice, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Thanks for watching.